the camera guy will. Hey guys, sorry about the wait. You know, standard kind of thing that happens when you leave your slides to the last minute. But we made it. And we're in for a 2-hour talk. It's a theory talk. I'm going to be talking about blockchain scaling. Kind of wish I was talking about governance after Aya's talk, all that super relevant stuff about vision and what we're doing. But I'm talking about governance tomorrow, also 2 hours. Come check it out. So let's get started on the tech stuff, though. Here we go. So we have a pretty long outline. We have a little primer. For people who saw my talk in Stanford, the first little bit is going to be very similar. I'm going to talk about consensus protocols and sharding, and I'm going to talk about the consensus protocols and sharding in theory. But then instead of just showing you a couple of GIFs and saying goodbye, I'm going to go through in like great depth the specifications of and give an example of these protocols so that you can kind of believe me that it's that it exists and you know, at least in theory. And then and that's going to involve looking at the consensus values, and then at the consensus client, and then finally at the fork choice rule that this client kind of uses to make decisions, and that kind of organizes the protocol. So, overview of consensus and sharding, talk about sharding in theory, and then I'm going to go into talking about the sharded consensus values for an example protocol, and then I'm going to talk about the client for the consensus protocol, and then I'm going to talk about the fork choice rule. And then we'll, you know, have some closing stuff. So, it's going to be a little ride. There's going to be some tough parts. I hope you bear with me. We're going to try to take it slow. So consensus protocols are all about making decisions in a distributed network in a way that's kind of consistent, where the decisions are in some way not contradictory across the network. And normally we want these decisions to be happening eventually. So we want them to be consistent and happening eventually. Normally we talk about that as like safety and liveness. And there's some other things that we want, but let's not worry about that too much. And the reason why this is hard is because in a distributed system, really, you know, nodes have different views of the network. They don't all see the same thing. And so it's really kind of challenging to get nodes to do things in a consistent way when they see rather different things. And also because there might be faults in the network. But, you know, consensus protocols like decide usually on values or on predicates of values. So when you decide on a consensus value, you know, you're going to decide with finality on a value. When you decide on a predicate, it's just like a property of a value. Like, for example, this block is in the blockchain. You know, then that basically is like, you know, you're not deciding on a blockchain forever. The blockchain keeps on growing, so you can't ever really decide on a blockchain. You have to decide on like properties of blockchains, like decide on a tail of a blockchain. Decide that you'll only ever choose a blockchain that has this tail. And somehow, usually, you understand decisions to be like output by the node or committed by the node. And so decisions, and this is some of the hard stuff, sorry guys. The decisions on the consensus values are consistent if they're the same, and not if they're not. And they're consistent in the, and properties of the consensus values are consistent if there is a value that satisfies all of them jointly. And they're not otherwise. So if I have a bunch of so like my example here is that like, you know, the decision on 110 is consistent only with the decision on 110 if we're deciding on values of 3-length binary strings. But if we're deciding on a predicate, like for example, this string starts with 1 or this string starts with 0, those are consistent because there exists a string 110 and another one 100 that start with 1 and end with 0. So, you know, if there is a string that satisfies all the predicates, then they're consistent. And these notions are kind of going to be important for us in sharding, as we'll see soon, because we're not going to be able to decide on the whole value, right? So kind of another thing that I really need to tell you by going into all this is that consensus protocols make decisions on a predefined domain of consensus values. There's like something that they're deciding about. A lot of times people imagine that it's like the order of events in a distributed system. Sometimes it's a bit. And we can be really flexible, actually, as to what exactly our consensus protocols are deciding on. But there's a predefined domain of values that they're deciding on. Great. So that was like the primer for consensus protocols. We're making decisions in a distributed network. There might be faults. We're making decisions on some kind of values, or a little indirectly by talking about properties of those values, or like predicates of those values. So, and we want to do this in a consistent way because that's what consensus protocols are about, right? You and I should agree on who has what balances for us to be able to use the thing as a currency, for example, or any interesting application of consensus protocols, really needs to make consistent decisions in a non-trivial way. So what is sharding? Sharding is about splitting things up in different parts, right? Sharding is about scaling by moving the network and splitting the network up so that it does different pieces of work with different nodes instead of everyone doing the same work. So if we split up the work, we could do more work. If we all do the same work, it's not that much getting done. So, it kind of has this term, came from maybe Ultima Online or this Computer Corporation of America paper from 1988 or later, Ultima Online. But it's kind of come in like the database and stuff world, like to be, used enough that I feel comfortable calling it sharding. But basically, sharding fundamentally kind of really means like, okay, there's more than one bit. It's more than one bit. So therefore, a bit is not sharded. There's no way for us to make a consensus protocol that's sharded if it's just deciding on a bit. And so this will help us really understand in a theoretical kind of way what is sharding all about, right? Because it's not a binary consensus protocol. There is no such thing as a sharded binary consensus protocol because all it does is decide on a bit. There's only two decisions it could make, and there's no sense in which it's more than one bit, which is kind of the definition of sharding. So binary consensus protocols are not sharded. And that kind of leads us to a nice little introduction to sharded consensus protocols in theory. Because we know there can't be a binary sharded consensus protocol, so we know where to start. We're going to need sharded consensus values, right? We need to have some notion of consensus value that isn't just singleton, but that somehow has different components. And the decisions in these decisions normally in protocols, remember, are on like the values or the predicates. But because we're in a sharded context, we're going to basically assume that we're talking about predicates that describe some but not all of the shards, right? So like we're going to be interested in making decisions on some shards and not others, and so we describe some of the consensus value, namely the bits over here or the bits over there. And this is a way to give a description of consensus value without saying exactly the whole consensus value, because you might not be aware of what's going on in the shards. So decisions are consistent, just like in the normal definition, if there is this sharded value that satisfies both of the predicates. And so if nodes make decisions across the network and they're different decisions on different predicates, we can still ask this very meaningful and important question of whether they're consistent. And so like we're going to be having clients, sharding clients, that are going to be trying to make decisions on predicates of these consensus values that describe the particular shards. Because the consensus value is supposed to be too big because it's sharded and it's scalable, it's big, for them to just to look at all of it, so they're only concerned about some of it. So sharding clients kind of have to be understood as light clients. I'm hoping to piggyback off of some of your previously hopefully existing knowledge on light clients. There's two kinds of light clients. There's light clients that only look at some of the consensus value, and there's light clients that only look at some of the consensus protocol messages. And these are very interesting, different orthogonal directions in the way that you can make a client light in a consensus protocol. Consensus value light clients are pretty much always about using some kind of commitment to some proof system so that you can have a small value that a client can use to prove facts that it's interested about the value without having to learn so much more about it. We see this all the time. We see this kind of today in the blockchain header use as a light client. The blockchain header provides these Merkle proofs, the Merkle roots that you use to check proofs. And those are really used by clients to test their predicates of consensus values, which are going to be something like my transaction is in this block. You know, it has this log, you know, whatever it might be. So, you know, there's also sharding solutions where, you know, they put like Merkle roots of changes that happen to the different shards in the same chain. And that is like kind of like this. It's kind of, you know, using consensus values as cryptographic accumulators to make kind of small consensus values that you can ask small questions about and therefore be light, right? Because you don't need to look at the whole thing. You can ask targeted questions about little bits of it using, you know, cryptography. So this is very much what we're used to. And there's another kind of light client called a protocol message light client, which is a client that doesn't look at all the messages. You know, it says like, oh, I don't need to look at those blocks. I only need to look at these ones, because it knows somehow that like only those blocks are relevant to its decision. So it only, you know, is strategic about what messages it receives, as opposed to just strategic about how it asks questions about the consensus values. So, you know, in some way, the altcoin scene is a big sharded consensus protocol where people are protocol message light clients, only asking for messages from their particular shard. And sharding solutions with different validator sets for different shards also are kind of like this, because, you know, assuming you don't need to hear from all the shards, you will only look at some of the validators, some of the messages from some of the validators, and thereby achieve some kind of light client friendliness or light clientness by not looking at all the messages, right? Because being light client just means like not doing as much work, right? And especially not doing as much work as the whole system, right? Because that's not scalable. So that was the kind of introductory part of the talk. Let me summarize. Oh my God, is this water for me? I think it is, yeah. So, the kind of the summary so far is that like to have a sharded consensus protocol, you need to have consensus values that are sharded. You need to have more than like a bit. To have a sharded consensus protocol that's scalable, you need to have clients that are light and that don't do all the work, right? They somehow need to like not look at all the consensus value or not look at all the messages, because that's what it means to do less work. You know, just having less data, processing less messages. So now we're going to get into the more concrete kind of part of the talk in some way, where I'm going to start to talk about some sharded consensus values that are going to, you know, give like multi-threaded execution of the Ethereum virtual machine with communication between the threads, to give you a more concrete idea of how this might translate into such a, like, you know, this high-level theory about sharding into something that's practical and more real. So we're going to have a blockchain for every shard, and we're going to have like messages being sent back and forth between these shards, and we're going to have like an EVM execution trace for every shard. That's a function of processing the transactions, but also the cross-shard messages when they're destined for the virtual machine. So I'm going to go to this in rather a lot of detail. So I hope you're excited. So a block has a shard ID. Out of some set of shard names, for now, let's assume. So this is like an example protocol. You know, it's like so that like we can see that this is real. At the end of the day, there's no guarantee that this is going to be a static set or whatever. But for now, we're making a lot of simplifying assumptions. So we have a block has to have a shard ID. It's like a new thing we don't usually have today already. This is something we're a little more used to. A block has a previous block. Or maybe it doesn't, and it's the genesis block. Or in this case, it's going to be a genesis block because there's a different genesis block for every shard. A block has a transaction list and an EVM post state. We're also kind of very used to this. Or it's the genesis block, in which case it has some genesis EVM state and no transaction list. A block has a source block for every neighbor shard. So basically, the kind of thing I didn't mention here is that like a shard has neighbors, but for every neighbor, it has a source block, which is kind of like where we're going to be drawing messages from. It's like this block might see a block from another shard, and it might be pulling some messages back, as part of the communication model. And so we call them source blocks. And a block has a list of sent messages to every neighbor, and it has a list of received messages for every neighbor. And now we're going to talk about messages. So that's basically like the block structure. So block has a pre-block, it has a shard ID, a shard ID has neighbors, a block has a source block for every neighbor, it has a sent and received message log or list for every neighbor. And now messages. Messages have payloads, which we might think of as like the call data, gas limit, ether, the normal Ethereum call. They have a time to live, which is kind of like the number of blocks by which it has to be included, or else it's expired. And it has this thing called a base, sometimes we call it target, which is the block from which that time to live is calculated. So like, the time to live has to start from somewhere, and it starts from this block. And when we make a block, this is actually going to be the same as the source block. But there's a reason we have to put it in the message, but we'll skip over that for a second. So, kind of summary again, the block has a shard ID, a previous block, a transaction list, an EVM state, source blocks for its neighbors, and sent and received messages for its neighbors. And messages have payloads, time to lives, and these like kind of base block, which we use to measure this time to live. So, and we have a bunch of other constraints. So that wasn't it. Those can't all just be independent anything. We have some constraints that kind of make it look, from any block's point of view, that things are kind of okay and normal from the point of view of cross-shard communication and cross-shard synchronization. So let me tell you what I mean. So here's like an example. Imagine if we have two sources on two blocks that are, one after the other. They're in the same chain. They don't have to be one after the other. They're just in the same chain. And these four sources have to also be in the same chain. So so this kind of situation here represents an invalid block, because your sources are always supposed to be consistent, right, in the same chain. So in this case, these two sources, F2 and A3, are different chains, and therefore this block B3 is invalid. Just like wasn't allowed to do that because it has a validity condition as a function of the previous blocks in its chain. If you receive a message after expiry, that's also invalid. This should be colored red. So like this message here is received more than time to live after the base for that message, and therefore it's invalid. Whereas like here we receive the message before and it's fine. So from the point of view of every block, all the messages need to be received by the time to live. We have this other source consistency condition, which says basically, look, I'm not allowed to use a source at a block that has a source that disagrees with this block. Like if I point, like this block B4 is invalid because from the point of view of its history, it doesn't have a nice, consistent story here. Because imagine A3 is receiving messages from C1, and now it's trying to suppose, for example, send messages to this chain, but this chain disagrees with it. So this block is invalid. It's a little more subtle, but things have to kind of look nicely from the point of view of every block, so that you can't make a block that like makes some weird inconsistent communication happen. So we have these kind of constraints, right? The messages arrive before expiry, that the sources are all consistent, so that it looks like, from the point of view of any block, that there's been a nice concurrent execution of the virtual machine, where like the messages have been delivered, and from a chain to another chain not from like random other forks of that chain to that chain. So blocks on the same shard are called inconsistent when they're not in the same blockchain. And this is kind of what we're used to today, where like two blocks are inconsistent. I mean, maybe we're used to, I don't know, if they're not on the same chain. Blocks on different shards are inconsistent if they disagree about the sources or fail to receive messages by the time to live. So if there's this kind of source inconsistency, or there isn't this synchronization where messages are received before the time to live, then those two blocks are inconsistent. So if I choose a block on one shard and a block on another, they can be inconsistent because of the way their sources and their messages correspond to each other's block structures. So a decision on a block basically represents, kind of like we were talking about in the theory, a decision on a predicate of a consensus value that says that this block is in some chain, and the consensus values here are specifically, we talked a lot about blocks, but the consensus values are really these executions of all the shards, right? It's not just like a single block. The consensus value is like a state of the blockchain for every shard, not just any blockchain for every shard. They have to be consistent, like according to these definitions. So we're constructing the consensus values to look like executions of the EVM with multiple threads that communicate nicely. And if they don't look like that, it's like not a consensus value. And therefore, if you make decisions that don't look like that, they're inconsistent decisions because there is no consensus value that satisfies them jointly. So we're defining the consensus values as these collections of consistent blockchains. And so decision on a block basically means that this block will be part of the multi-threaded execution of the virtual machine. Great. So that was like another kind of doozy section. So basically we talked about the block structure, the message structure, and what it means to decide on a block, or what the consensus values are. And what it means for decisions to be consistent on blocks, and what it means for them to be inconsistent. So remember, blocks have previous block pointers and also pointers to blocks on other shards, and they have message queues to other shards, and they're inconsistent with each other if they don't point to each other in a way that looks like they each have an individual history that they're watching, and if they don't receive messages from each other by the time to live, by expiry. And we decide on blocks, meaning that like we decide that this block is part of the concurrent execution schedule. And so if you're deciding on some block in shard I and I'm deciding on some block in shard J, they might be consistent or not. So the protocol somehow is supposed to guarantee that these decisions are consistent. But so far all I've talked about is the domain of consensus values that we're trying to decide on. So you don't know anything about that, presumably, yet. All we know about is like, okay, we're not deciding on a bit, we're deciding on this kind of complicated block structure that like we can use to represent communicating threads of the Ethereum virtual machine. Great. I'm glad everyone is 100% following everything. You have a question? Sure. Oh, here we go, microphone.
Slide, you had like shard A, showing that like the message, shard A sent a message to shard B, and the block, and the block was invalid. Maybe not this one, maybe it was the other one?
Yeah, this one?
Yeah, it was this one.
Yeah.
So does this mean that A can essentially DDoS B by attesting to essentially like the other?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, yes. Although you can't tell from this point of the picture. Like you should, like somehow that depends on the fork choice rule.
Right.
And like if they were completely independent and we didn't care about the consistency of these communications, you could just have a perspective on shard A that looks like everything is fine, and perspective on shard B that looks like everything is fine, even though they conflict mutually. So like so the block validity though condition can be detected locally. So like this block on shard B3 is just invalid on shard B3. Sorry, on shard B. This block B3 on shard B is invalid on invalid on shard B, just locally, right? So the fact that shards can kind of have like correlated decisions doesn't actually, strictly speaking, come out of the block validity rules. That has to do more with this relationship between choices of valid blocks between shards, right? So there's the valid blocks. Just because you have valid blocks everywhere doesn't mean that your decisions between shards are going to be consistent. And the DOSing of shards via one another isn't really going to come out of the validity constraints. It's going to come out of the fork choice rule trying to maintain consistency between the decisions on different shards. Good question. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what time it is, but I think we could do another question if anyone has one. Okay. Yeah. Wait a second. No worries.
You said that each shard has neighbors and
Yeah.
keeps a list of neighbors. How long is that list, and how does the shard find the neighbors?
Well, it's part of the protocol and it's not defined. So they find it out by looking at the protocol specification, and the protocol specification isn't fully defined, so I can't tell you how long that list is. I can tell you that one shard has no. Oh, never mind. No, I can't tell you much about that. Sorry. No, I guess I can tell you that at least one shard only has one neighbor. But not from anything I've told you so far here, from something that I'm going to mention later. And actually, at the end of the day, we're going to be talking about some fancy stuff where the shards move around and change their neighbors, and then it'll become less part of the protocol, but more part of the consensus values. And that will make things less confusing. The reason why the neighbors aren't in the block is because they're part of the protocol, and so I don't need to put them in the block because they never change. Yeah, good question. So now we're going to talk about the client, right? The client that's going to be making decisions on blocks in this sharded domain of consensus values. There's two kinds of light clients, remember. There's consensus value light client, and there's protocol message light clients. So we're going to define these clients. We're going to, for this protocol, to kind of get to the point where hopefully eventually I can convince you that this is going to be a scalable thing. So we're going to redefine our consensus values using hashes instead of nesting. Something I snuck in earlier is that actually I wasn't even using hashes. I was just saying that a block has the whole other block in there, just because it's semantically nice. And now in our new light client-friendly block header consensus values, we have shard ID still because those, let's say, are smaller than the hash, so you might as well. And we have previous block hash instead of a previous block, right? We have a Merkle root of the transactions instead of the transactions. We'll have a Merkle root of the EVM tree instead of the EVM state itself. We're going to have hashes of source blocks instead of the actual blocks. We're going to have Merkle roots of the sent and received lists. Although I'm actually, a little bit lying about that. Maybe we want to see the messages for the fork choice rule. But in any case, we're not going to see the whole payload. We don't need to see the whole payload, and we don't need to see the whole block that's the base. We can just look at its hash, because that's going to be enough for the light client for most of its concerns. And then when it really needs to know about the contents of something, it can ask in the normal light client friendly way for a Merkle proof. So this is relatively non-radical stuff, I hope. Even though now we're introducing cryptography, which is a little weird. I guess we're all comfortable with that here. We're going to use hashes, these cryptographic hashes, instead of the blocks themselves, and we're going to kind of assume that these are non-invertible functions. You can't compute the inverse map. So that we basically haven't really changed the semantics, almost, knock on wood. But we have this much more light client friendly construction because you can do these cool crypto proof systems. So that was relatively easy. Just replace some things with some hashes. It's pretty satisfying. Now for the protocol message light clients, it's a little harder, but it's very similar, very similar. And what we're going to do is basically modify the CBC Casper spec that I shared in that draft, released DevCon shortly after, to express light clients. And this is going to be basically the I'm going to describe a little bit now the CBC Casper protocol for light clients. So basically, normally in the minimal paper, which is designed to share the smallest understandable thing that you can check the proof out, it describes a full node protocol where basically if you have a message in your state, any messages that are in its justification, which basically is the place where it points to other messages, also have to be in your state. So you have to if a message depends on another one, you have to have both. So you have to have closure under this notion of justification. Whereas in the light client spec, we're going to need to give nodes the ability to selectively download these messages. We can't force them to download every dependency of every message, right? Imagine if the result would be that they would have to download messages from all the shards, which is the opposite of what we're looking for in this context. So they're going to need to be able to selectively download messages from the justification of protocol messages, which is a change from the current spec. And another big change, in the old one, we had in the minimal spec, it's a nesting of messages instead of using hashes. And so, these messages blow up really big and they, include all the other ones. And so even if we optionally got to include their justifications in our state, in some way we'd still be including them because of the nesting. And so we have to get rid of the nesting and also replace the nesting with hashes. Just as we kind of just did for our blockchain thing in this nifty kind of trick. So, but the kind of gimmick is that we have to maintain and use the same consensus safety proof because the CBC Casper family of protocols all satisfy this proof, and the proof is really simple and elegant, and is the thing that makes it so easy to do all this work, really. And so we have to still satisfy the same proof, but now that we've changed the specification a bit, we have to kind of rejigger it a little bit, right? Because the protocol underneath is a little bit different. And in this proof, if you remember, if you've looked at it, or if you've watched me present about it before, we kind of show that nodes have a common feature protocol state if there's not more than T Byzantine faults, equivocation by weight faults exhibited in their protocol state. Sorry. In the union of their states. So we have kind of this setup where protocol states are sets of messages, and where you can detect this kind of fault in the set of messages. And if in the union of our protocol states, which is just a bigger set of messages, we detect more than T faults, then we might not have a common future state. But if we detect less than T faults, or not more than T faults, then we'll have a common future protocol state. And this is kind of a cornerstone theorem that the consensus safety rests on, is this idea that if there's not too many faults, then we can all transition to the same state where we're going to be consistent kind of almost trivially. So as long as we can maintain the existence of a common future state, we're going to have safety, and there's a really simple mechanism that we use to do that. Oh yeah, I mentioned this, should have had the slide up, but the protocol states are sets of messages, and the state transition thing is receiving messages. So we're growing sets of messages is kind of the abstraction for the protocol states. I have a question up there. Thank you so much. And so from a set of messages, we can kind of see some things sometimes. Yeah.
Hey, thank you. So if I download selectively these messages to validate a specific state, isn't that also a privacy concern? Because I basically, share some sort of information about the state that I'm interested in.
Yes. Yeah, that seems like it might be a privacy concern.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll solve that, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure people will get concerned about that, yeah. I skipped a few slides, did I? Oh, wow. Oh, geez, don't look there. So protocol states are sets of messages, and we receive messages, and we transition to new protocol states that have more messages. It's a pretty natural kind of setup. And in the CBC Casper spec, they've got a minimal one with a nesting, and just like the simple to specify, then prove, and like reason about one. Somewhat easier. 2 distinct messages from the same validator and equivocation if neither of them include them in the justification. So if like message 1 isn't in messages 2 justification, or message 2 isn't in message 1's justification, then it's called an equivocation. It looks like they haven't been just honestly including all the messages they previously made in their next one, and they kind of made a little fork, and that was somehow bad. Like this is like what we call an equivocation fault. And this is the way that we normally look at it. So we have 2 messages. The messages have 3 parts, and this is the fault counter in the minimal CBC Casper spec. We have 2 messages. One of them has this consensus value and that justification. So messages have 3 parts: a consensus value, validator, and justification. Consensus value, validator, justification. And these 2 messages are an equivocation if they're not the same message, but the first one isn't in the justification of the second, and the second isn't in the justification of the first. So this is like this behavior that I was talking about. So this function f, what it does is it calculates the total weight of the nodes who have been caught equivocating. This is like the fault weight counter. And this is a super important part of the protocol specification, because the protocol specification basically says, look, any set of messages that has not more than T total fault weight. So you need to like have the weight counter and prevent your protocol from evolving to a state that has more than T faults. So it's a really core part of the protocol definition is the weight counter. And now we have to kind of change the definition because we can't just do set inclusion in the justification anymore because we don't have like a set of messages there. And the messages are going to be somewhat different. Instead of having a set of messages here, we're going to have a set of hashes. And usually before we had this notion of validity that the consensus value had to be in the estimator, this like fork choice rule-like thing of the justification. Now we like do the same thing on the inverse of the hashes. But the kind of interesting, so this is the message. This is like the message construction. I didn't have a similar one for this one, but there's a validity condition that relates the consensus value to the justification, so that the consensus value isn't just arbitrarily chosen. It has to be justified according to this fork choice rule-like thing. So over here, we have a similar justification, but now we have to justify it in terms of these hashes, or really the inverse of those hashes. And we have a fault counter that looks slightly different. The fault counter, what it does is it checks if the hashes are in the justifications, as opposed to checking if the messages are in the justifications. So I said it would change, but it didn't change much. All that happened is that now we check the hashes before we check for membership, because like we're no longer dealing with sets of messages, we're dealing with hashes. So now we're still able to detect the weight of equivocations from protocol states. We just have like a slightly different definition of equivocation. It's still 2 validators not sending messages that are in each other's justification, but like instead of the message not being in each other's justification, it's like the hash of the message isn't in each other's justification. Really similar definition. We just have to like thread the hashing through there. And now we actually have achieved some amount of flexibility, because we don't have this full node constraint that we had before, which stopped us from having a selective set of messages in our protocol state. Now we can have like any set of message, barring the constraint that they can't exhibit too many faults in our protocol state. So we could really have any message in our protocol state and any other from 2 different validators, and that's like totally fine because like they can't be equivocating. So there's like a lot more freedom that we have now in this specification to download whatever messages we want whenever we want them. The question is, so that, like I've kind of gotten my head of myself, but I mentioned like we're going to constrain the consensus protocol states to only exhibit not more than T faults. So like we have this fault counter defined. We're not going to allow the protocol states to transition to states that have more than T faults. And so just as we do in the same CBC Casper consensus protocol. And so now we have this kind of proof obligation to running through the same proof again to make sure that it all works out. And then we have the consistency of decisions guaranteed by the safety proof for the consensus protocols. So we need to show the first cornerstone theorem that if the union of two of these nodes protocol states doesn't exhibit more than T faults, then they have a common future state. And my witness is the union itself. So the union itself is a future of all these states because the union itself is supposed to not have more than T faults and is a superset of each of these states, and they can all transition to this set by receiving those messages. So we have this common future protocol state, which is the union of their protocol states. And so that guarantees that they have a common future, assuming that the union doesn't have T or more faults. So that's pretty good. So we have a common future state if there's not more than T faults in the union of protocol states according to the exact same argument as before. And there's the converse where like if two nodes don't have a common future protocol state, what that must mean is that there are more than T faults in the union of their views, 2 and whatever. And this is like the way nice interpretation of the safety result, which is that like if we have a failure, then there must have been more than T faults. So that's the kind of first cornerstone part of the consensus safety theorem. I didn't want to cover the second part twice, so I just passed over it earlier. The second part basically says, look, we're going to use the existence of a common future to guarantee the consistency of decisions on predicates of consensus values. And the way that we're going to do that is through this notion of this estimator or a fork choice rule that relates protocol states to consensus values. And it's going to basically talk about what are the valid guesses of consensus values from different protocol states. And a property of consensus values is called decided if in all future protocol states, all of the values of the estimator satisfy that property. So from this set of messages in all supersets that exhibit less than T faults, the estimator or / fork choice rule will have this property. Then it's decided. So that's the definition of decided that we use in the CBC Casper world. It's kind of like invariant in all future protocol states. And so we kind of have this guarantee that they're going to be consistent because they have a common future state. And so if something's invariant in their future states and they have a common future state, it must hold in their common future state. And since it holds in their common future state, that means that any of the values of the estimator at that state will inhabit and satisfy all of those properties, which is the definition of consistency. So we're golden on the consistency front with this definition of decisions. So, and we have this common future guaranteed if there's not too many faults. So we kind of, all in all, have consistent decisions if there's not too many faults, which is the consensus safety result, or really like flip the other way, the only way to have inconsistent decisions is if there are more than T faults. And that's kind of like the baseline requirement for a consensus protocol to be safe. And my claim is that I just ran through the proof sketch and it looks exactly the same as the CBC Casper proof for the full nodes. Only there's hashes that had to be kind of threaded through everything. So, but it's the same proof, same principle. That we have a common future state, which is the union of our states, and we have the same notion of decided, which are invariants in all of our future states. The thing that has changed a little bit now is that the estimator has to be defined over a much broader set of states. Like before, the fork choice rule was only defined on these full node states. Now it somehow needs to be defined on more states. And we're about to get there. But let me take a sip of water first. Yeah, Martin has a question. I'm sure it's going to be good.
I'm a little confused with how the abstract proof, where you talk about messages, applies to this light client setting. And specifically, I'm wondering what it seems like we have two notions of dependencies, where it's the dependencies of messages being included from neighbor shards and the blocks that are directly below you. Are both of those dependencies included in the justification of messages?
So over here, in this level of the specification, I wasn't looking at the consensus value light client at all. It was just the protocol message light client, and so the consensus values were just kind of a black box to me. Like, I don't even know they're sharded in this light client spec. What I do know is that I don't need to look at all of the messages and the justifications of the consensus values. So the spec that I gave here is specifically the protocol message light client, not the consensus value light client. And so the nesting of the blocks underneath, like, I don't know. It depends on the consensus value. Is it a header chain? Is it like a, so like that kind of depends. But with respect to the consensus messages, the consensus protocol messages, it says that, like, there's the messages and the justification are kind of covered by hashes, and like you could download them if you want, as long as they don't show you too many faults.
So to actually decide if something is an equivocation, you would need to like look at the contents of what generated all those hashes.
So
is that true?
there's different things that you could decide are equivocations. There's messages in your protocol state, and there's messages that are not in your protocol state. So if you're talking about messages that are not in your protocol state, like, yeah, that's one way to get them, is by downloading the dependencies of the messages that you have, and that could reveal equivocations. But you can also get new equivocations by downloading messages that aren't in the dependency of the message that you already have.
Okay, cool.
That's definitely one of the interesting areas where, like, you could discover equivocations in your justification. And the interesting thing that happens there actually is that it kind of forces a kind of triviality of the decision. So here's kind of a thought experiment. This is kind of going a little deep, you guys, I'm sorry. Imagine we have a protocol state that has more than T faults in its extension of all of its dependencies. Then there's two possible ways, at least, to extend their dependencies. One that shows that side of the equivocation, and one that shows this side of the equivocation. And they're mutually exclusive in that if one node extended one and one node executed the protocol by resolving the others, they would not have a common future state anymore. And so you could get to from the same state just by resolving the dependencies or downloading the justifications, get to two states that don't have a common future state. And now suppose that on one of those P is decided and on the other not P is decided, then what that means is that neither P or not P could be decided in that initial state. And so in the weird cases where this dependency leads to different decisions, then it can't have been the case that those decisions were made in the initial state before it was unrolled. And so rather than it leading to inconsistency, it leads to a kind of more triviality in the sense that there's no decision in those cases that you would suspect might be inconsistent. Definitely interesting deep end stuff. Sorry, guys, going there. But I'm sure if you find it curious, that's great. Come ask me more later. Yeah, I mean, if there's any more questions, can anyone tell me how much time I have left? There's a question down here.
When the inconsistency, actually the dependency is very long. For example, you have like two forks for one shard A, A1 and A2, and A1 depends on B, and B depends on C, C depends on A2. So here the inconsistency is actually very long. How do you detect this?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and like what we end up doing in this example is we're going to arrange the shards in a tree, and it's going to stop that from happening. But in general, yeah, that's definitely an interesting and challenging issue. Sorry, grab the microphone, would you?
this dynamic, right? So it will be more even more complicated.
Yeah, and we have done actually a changing of the shards while still moving from tree shape to tree shape, and we've been able to sort everything through because, like, from the point of view of every block, it's always like a tree, even though in some way overall there's these cycles. But definitely this is something that we're kind of, mindful of, and we just don't let the cycles happen.
Okay, yeah. But if you want to change the structure of the tree along with time, then you need to kind of have another level of consistency or consensus to maintain this, right, among all the shards.
Yes and no. So, like, the definition of the consistency doesn't change actually, because the shards always are like single threaded, and they always have like a consistent, like, kind of view. So somehow, I'm not sure that the definition of consistency changes, but definitely the fork choice rule and the validity and the questions that you ask are going to be like different. The shards you're looking at, like your neighbors, are going to change.
Yeah, actually, I agree that the fork choice rule is the key to solve this. Yeah, I
Sweet.
agree with this.
Okay, great. So if no one else has any questions, let's get going. All right, so now we're going to talk about the fork choice rule, right? So the fork choice rule is going to relate our protocol states to the consensus values, right? Somehow I'm going to relate this abstract light client that I just made up to these sharded protocols, right? These sharded blockchains, the different blockchain for every shard with the messages and the pointers. You remember, I hope. So we're gonna take consensus values from the sharded blockchain thing, and our protocol states from the thing from the minimal CBC, from the light client CBC spec that we just gave. So for clients to make a decision, they need to understand what messages they need to actually look at, right? We kind of said that, look, a client can look at whatever messages they want, but we haven't actually said which they should look at, right? So it's gonna get a little more concrete here, because we're gonna structure the fork choice rule to help inform them, so that they have like a clue about what messages to look at to decide on the blocks on different shards. So we're gonna kind of, connect the decisions on different blocks to different sets of validators that are responsible for the fork choice on different shards. We're going to assign like different, assume mutually exclusive, just so they don't have to think about it, subsets of validators to different shards. And this way a client knows, okay, which validators are on which shards. Let's assume as part of the protocol. And furthermore, we're going to separate the neighbors out into two kinds of neighbors, parent and child. And we're going to say, look, you only have one parent at most, and only one shard has no parents. And so this forces us into this tree shape of neighbors, where the children are further down in the tree than the parents. So, and then we're going to make the fork choice rule of a shard be independent of the fork choice rule of its children. The flip side is that, like, what we're really trying to say here is that we're going to make it dependent only on the fork choice rule of its parent. So if I know the fork choice rule of the parent, I can execute the fork choice rule of the child, but I don't need to know the fork choice rule of the child to execute the fork choice of the parent. It's kind of this one-way dependency of child on parent. And this is going to achieve a whole bunch of stuff for us. It's going to let validators know what validators they need to hear from in order to make decisions. It's going to show them that they don't need to hear from everyone. They only need to hear from some subset of the validator set. And it's going to allow us to make the decisions on different shards dependent, which is super important because, as we kind of remember, the decisions on different shards are only consistent based on property of, the blocks, like a relationship between those blocks. And so we really need the choice of the shard on choice of fork on different shards to not be independent. Right? It'd be really kind of easy if if they were independent, but we need non-independent choices so that we can have consistency across shards of things like the ether supply and all sorts of different kind of cross-shard communication guarantees. The call I sent is the one that's received, and when I receive a message back, it was actually sent by the place it was supposed to be sent from. And there's all sorts of cross-shard consistency that we need. And so this property of the children's fork choice being dependent on the parents is going to be really operative. And so now I'm going to give a fork choice rule that fits all those constraints that I mentioned and guarantees that our cross-shard communication won't fail and that our cross-shard synchronization won't fail. So here's the fork choice rule in English. So the first thing to note is that the root shard executes the latest message-driven ghost protocol independently of any other shards. It's kind of just does its own thing on valid blocks. It looks at its blocks and it'll just run ghost on them. And then the other shards are going to do almost the same thing, but they're going to orphan blocks that, quote, failed to synchronize with the fork choice of its parent. So, and what does it mean to fail to synchronize? Well, we're going to basically, we're calling them filter conditions. We filter those blocks out before we run ghost. Basically, ghost is no longer allowed to choose those blocks because they somehow fail to synchronize with the parent shard. And notice that this filtering is about a relationship with the fork choice of the parent. It's not about, it's not a local validity condition, right? So there's very clean separation between the stuff that's enforced by the fork choice and the stuff that's enforced by the validity conditions. So here they are, the four kind of conditions. So the shard here on the right, shard B, is the child shard. These three blocks here are out of sync with the parent because in the parent fork choice, there's a source to a block that disagrees with them. So the parent in his fork choice here ends at an A4. It points to B2. These blocks are not consistent with B2. They are orphaned. So even though they might have been chosen by ghost in the child shard otherwise, because it's not synchronizing with the parent fork choice rule, they're going to be orphaned. So, throw those blocks out and then run ghost. Another thing that can happen is a block could, on the child, have a source on the parent that got orphaned in the parent. So in this diagram here, the parent orphaned this block that is the source of this child block, and therefore these two blocks need to be orphaned. Those two blocks both have sources that are inconsistent with the fork choice of the parent, and therefore don't synchronize with the parent in this way that we expect. If a block in the child fails to receive a message by the time to live, it gets orphaned. So imagine if in the fork choice of the parent there's a message sent to the child and there's a block in the child that doesn't receive that message by the time to live, it will also get orphaned. So these two blocks up here, they failed to receive this message from A2 that had to be received by the time to live here, which is 2 heights. And they didn't do it. And so they didn't know maybe about this block ever existing at the time they were made. It's totally legit. But eventually the fork choice rule became this, and it sent this message, and these two aren't really allowed to be in the fork choice rule of the child because the child has to receive those messages by the time to live. If they're being sent by the parent like that. And similarly, if a child sends a message to the parent and the parent doesn't receive it by the time to live, that block has to be orphaned, right? If you're sending a message to the parent and the parent doesn't accept it or doesn't receive it for whatever reason, you're not synchronizing with the parent, you gotta go. And those are the four filter conditions. 2 of them to do with the child block disagreeing with the fork choice, either with its source or with sources from the fork choice, and 2 of them to do with the child either not receiving a message by the time to live or failing to have a message be received by the parent by the time to live. So notice it's always the child orphaning in the blocks in order to maintain synchronization with the parent, because we have this constraint that the parent's fork choice is independent of the children. And this really will help us make sure that you don't have to look at all the shards, because you don't need to look at the children of any shard to determine the fork choice rule of that shard. So here's kind of the claim, that these constraints are enough that cross-shard atomicity failures can't happen because they will be eventually orphaned. Because one of these rules will say, look, you have to be filtered out of the fork choice, and therefore you'll be orphaned by the fork choice, which is a function of the parent shard. And here is this like demo of exactly this protocol that I just described, using exactly these filter conditions and these validity conditions that I described. So you can see here what happens is sometimes there's a bunch of blocks that are produced in the child and then orphaned. Those, let's see if we can see it happen. If not, we'll just have to wait for this thing to restart because it happened a little earlier. I'm going to try, oh, there we go. We saw it for a second. So what I'm trying to see here is the fork choice, which is this green line, not make it all the way to the end because of the filter conditions that drop blocks. So here it's going to be lazy. See that block for a second? Look at this one. Look at this. You see these blocks are getting orphaned even though they're at the tip of the chain? It's because they don't synchronize with the parent, meaning that they don't receive messages in time or, by expiry, and therefore need to be orphaned by the child block. And so these thick purple lines correspond to a sent message being received in the fork choice of the parent and the child. And the nice thing about the model is that we get like once-in-time message delivery in order, as you kind of might want. And these little thin ones are a message that was sent or received from a block that's orphaned. And so I'm still just drawing them, but those aren't in the fork choice rule anymore. So the claim here is that the CBC Casper client for this blockchain won't make inconsistent cross-shard decisions. Remember that cross-shard decisions are inconsistent if you choose blocks that are inconsistent in the sense of this pointer thing and the message delivery thing, which exactly are the ways in which we're orphaning blocks if they don't satisfy. Basically, the clients can determine what validators they have to hear from, right? If they're interested in a shard, they got to know from that they got to know all the validators on that shard, all the validators on its parent, all the validators on its parent, all the validators on its parent, and so on. So, a logarithmic number of validators in the total, assuming that every shard has the same number. And therefore, they need to hear only a really small minority of the messages, which is, kind of unless we have like you could have had, like in this previous example, just like not a tree, but a single row of shards, and that wouldn't necessarily do it for all the shards because the one at the bottom would need to see all of them. But if there's a single shard with more than one child, then we like achieve some scalability. And these, so like I really think, I'm convinced that like clients deciding on blocks are really going to implement a scalable blockchain consensus protocol in the sense that we have a blockchain for every shard. So this is kind of the claim. I hope I've illustrated it enough, but I'm ready for questions and clarifications, just in case I haven't really tied the knot enough. Yeah, please. Over here.
You mentioned that you arrange all the shards in a tree structure, right? And then if you want to have a cross-shard transaction between two leaves, then it might need to go a very long path, right?
Yeah, that's right. So we have kind of, you kind of need to we kind of do modify the, basically this was like the simple example, but what we like to do is, have a routing system. So I didn't really mention the routing, but yeah, we have to route across the path to get it around through the system. Yeah.
Okay, that's probably sometimes not that efficient.
Well, but you have but it's really strongly guaranteed to be atomic in the sense that either the whole route will be eventually finalized or completely orphaned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's.
Assuming that the protocol is live.
Hi, regarding the time to live requirement for the child blocks, is there a possibility of ending up in kind of a bad state where they're there's many messages with the same TTL, and so they all have to really go into the last block, but those messages are such that they can't all be included in the same block because of the gas costs, and so that chain is sort of broken, where the previous block was fine, but there's no way to validate the next block. Do you have to like, go back 2 blocks, or how does that work?
So at the moment, doesn't involve gas limits or any of that kind of consideration, but absolutely it's going to matter, and definitely something that we're going to need to think about. I mean, there's like these things where you have like you could allocate gas, but then what about then like you're not really operating at capacity because of the unused allocated gas. But it's definitely an interesting problem, and something that if you want to work on. Anyone else? Anything? Any questions? Yeah. Okay, over there. I guess not really playing the traveling salesman microphone game.
Hi, I'm wondering, do you think it will be possible, and if so, any direction, how to do synchronous cross-shard communications?
Yeah, so we're totally looking into synchronous cross-shard communication, and basically, you can definitely have like a synchronous communication model. You're not going to have like exactly the atomicity that we're used to today, but you can have a contract like wait for a return value and be kind of blocked there until it receives the return value and then execute other messages only afterwards. The concern and issue with that is basically deadlocks. And so, if you have like you can have like a deadlock happen. And so you have to kind of clear the deadlock, and there's definitely, we're doing ongoing research in that, although I would say that if in today's virtual machine, like the solution to this deadlock situation is reentrancy. And it's presumably preferable to deadlock. And so, but then if you're doing reentrancy, okay, it's not exactly a synchronous call anymore. So somehow, like we already don't have synchronous calls exactly. But it's definitely an interesting area of research that we're kind of digging into, because we don't really know the best communication model for smart contracts. We just want to provide options and let people test them and see what they like. Over there again, yeah.
So actually, I have a follow-up question with my previous one. So right now, because of the tree structure, all the cross-shard transaction from the left subtree to the right subtree need to cross the root shard, right? So do you think it would be a bottleneck?
Yeah. So I mean, I think this is the reason why like balancing is super important, and like the approach that I have is load balancing. So the idea is like, okay, we're going to move actually the shards around and the contracts around in order to minimize the overhead of the solution and to maximize the scaling that we get. Because yeah, the routing has overhead, and things are faster if they're closer together. And this, I think, is one reason why multi-level sharding is a little bit more sophisticated than like just one level, because routing everything through the hub is, could be a bottleneck, yeah.
Hi.
Hey, Rick.
How's it going, Vlad?
I'm all right.
Do you have any thoughts or views on data availability of what's actually hashed and how that gets moved from shard to shard?
Yeah, that's a great question, and leads me right into my next section in my talk of like other relevant work / future directions in this research, or like related closely enough to the research. So we talked a little bit about this right now, just like the message routing and the shard rotation. Validator rotation we haven't really mentioned, but we want to change the validators around. We're actually going to make some changes to the consensus values and be a little tricky about how we do that. So like we have definitely some more changes to make to the protocol. And one of the things that is kind of relevant to these protocols is actually guaranteeing that these blocks are valid and available. So far, I was just assuming that, look, this is actually the hash of a valid message. and that like if I need to get a message from a block, if I need to download blocks from a shard, I'll be able to. And these are kind of like known to be some of the like I guess potential problem areas with sharding solutions is like assume that like no one knows that something is invalid, or like no one can tell that some block is unavailable. It could lead to problems going forward because clients can't decide, clients can't join, clients decide on things that involve invalid things in the justification. But the reason why this isn't part of the solution at this level is because these are not consensus protocol issues, right? These are availability and validity issues, which are in some way a categorically simpler distributed systems problem because they don't involve the consistency of decisions across the network, but are local questions that can be verified locally. And so, we can build and have built and are looking at more building, like at least in theory, and we're going to build them in practice eventually, systems that have all of the kind of properties that we want out of the consensus, but here also, fault tolerance, the economic incentivization, and the, normal kind of security stuff that we talk about. So the answer actually is basically that, like, yes, it's an issue. Yes, it could really screw things up, but the computer science actually is relatively easier, and the to provide like fault tolerance, economically secure solutions. Although this has taken a lot of attention because it's a problem that everyone, that all the sharding solutions have. Like every sharding solution has to deal with this somehow. And so it's definitely an interesting one. I have thoughts, but I actually believe that like having the scalable blockchain architecture really helps solve these problems because you can actually use the smart contracts available in the scalable system to do some of the games that are associated with block validity and availability protocols. Challenge response games with cryptography, and smart contract. So I think that the correct approach really is to solve blockchain scaling first, and then to build the data availability and validity layer on top of it. Just like today, we expect the blockchain to keep itself available and valid. We should expect shards to keep themselves available and valid in a distributed way, and not just with a single centralized availability and validity solution.
Oh, okay. So I guess for me, one of the last things you said there was really sort of got to the essence of my concern, which is that we see the limits of data availability in the existing blockchain solutions. In Ethereum 1.0 world, we can very quickly imagine a situation where we don't have at least a convenient answer for data availability. I agree that these are easier problems categorically to solve, but I think that there's still, I think within the community at large, there's a sort of ostrich head in the sand around how expensive data availability really is, and I think that, so sort of to prompt your response here, are you worried that in a sharding context, the real sort of, you'll have this algorithm that'll be very powerful and correct, but the thing that actually limits the system is the availability of the data?
I'm not super worried about it at this level of the protocol spec because I haven't said how many shards there are, and I'm pretty confident that we could do 2. I'm pretty sure we could do 4. I don't know at what point it starts to be harder, but I'm comfortable with the idea that we can figure out whether the data is available super robustly, how many, and we can think about what is the cost of a node and bandwidth, and do the kinds of calculations. And actually, one of the things that makes me most optimistic about solving this in the long run is the idea that with scalability, we can have actually realistic peer-to-peer micropayment markets for downloading these files. Because like if people were paid, if it wasn't a public good to provide this, but it's actually like if there's like a market for file provision that is like, you know, efficient and scalable, then I think that this solution, you know, although the public subsidy kind of protocol is still interesting, you know, is a lot more manageable because it's not being provided as a public good anymore like it is today, right? Like if you look at like, oh, my favorite example is like the EOS availability problem, where it was like free to make transactions, and now they have like, I don't know, just like you know, too much data. And we have this rent issue in Ethereum too, and like, you know, blockchain sharding doesn't get rid of the need for rent. And so I think like this general trend of moving away from assuming that people will provide things with public goods and paying for them if they can be, you know, if we can design the mechanisms so that they don't have to be provided with public goods, will make us feel like a lot more comfortable about the sustainability of you know, these like essentially public, I mean, essentially public services of finding blocks. Some more things that are relevant and a little bit that I haven't discussed yet is this idea that, like, you know, of like protocol behavior, strategies, and liveness. So far, all I've really discussed here is like the message structure, right? Just like data types, like the like data type of the protocol state, and like the data type of the messages. I haven't talked about like when nodes should make messages, when nodes should receive messages, and like what their strategy is very much at all. And that's something that is, you know, ongoing research, and I'll mention a little bit more later maybe about it, but please, question.
Yeah, probably I'm a bit ahead. So I want to ask about the incentive design. So right now, because of the tree structure, I guess the shards, they are not equally, don't have an equal role in the, I mean, economically, right?
Yeah.
So do you have some like plans for this?
Yeah. So basically there's like a few responses. Like one of them is validator rotation, right? Validators move around. You don't get to decide that like your validator is going to camp in the root shard and like you don't, you know, you're never leaving. So validators like will have to move. Another thing is that the shards rotate also. So we can, you know, and also the smart contracts move around. And so like at the end of the day, when we like are really talking about like the kind of the target that I like, you know, I'm envisioning that actually will be usable and like really usable. Yeah, I'm thinking about like
what I
the
feel
load
like
balancing and the rotation really homogenizes it a lot.
It's getting too complicated, so it's really hard to design.
Yeah,
a
so
good model for
you would think so, and I mean like that's one of the really cool things about this whole approach. I think is that like the extent to which I could come up with really complicated consensus protocols in a really disciplined way of choosing the consensus values separately first, and then choosing the fork choice rule, and understanding that my decisions will be consistent because of the framework, and not having to worry about the distributed system stuff almost at all because of the definitions and framework that we have.
Yeah.
So I think that like, you know, that's like ode to the theoretical foundations.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
I'm not really concerned.
Actually,
it's too
we are
complicated.
also like designing a sharding protocol.
Who's we? Who's we?
Who it's different trade-offs, so maybe we can discuss afterwards.
Okay, sure.
Yeah. Thank
Okay.
you for the great talk.
Yeah, no worries, my pleasure. And also, so yeah, incentive design, all the proof of stake stuff, right? Bonding, unbonding, like fees, penalties. We also like are gonna have and want engineering and like efficiency improvements in our algorithms. And we're gonna eventually want to do like performance profiling and like, you know, of actual, let's get some idea of like, you know, how scalable might it be using like, for example, like today's Ethereum transactions or something that generates transactions that like tries to give us an idea. So here's this like GIF of the pretty cool like with the system with a routing and shard rotation. This one's a cool one, and this is one of my personal favorites. This is like showing the rotation of the root shard And like, there's still like the notion of parent and child in this system is defined on a per block basis. And the purple blocks are parent blocks and the beige blocks are child blocks. And that provides like a much less hierarchical structure. And like provides less of a centrality to the root shard, which I think is like, it feels really good to have that. So basically what I've tried to kind of, so there's like, I guess like a few takeaways, right? We really need to think about like the consensus values that we're deciding on with the scalable consensus protocol as like sharded consensus values. We need to think about our light clients, about our consensus clients as light clients that aren't looking at the whole value and aren't looking at all the messages. These protocols exist, and it's a supernatural way to scale consensus. I think, and I hope that you've noticed that like all or almost all the decisions that we've made have been very minimal, natural kind of choices, not trying to do too much or use anything too heavy duty. And so like, I would say like sharding is actually like a relatively simple thing in theory right now to me. In this consensus protocol world, like we can really like shard them by sharding the consensus values and having light clients. And we have like the same consensus safety proof, like it doesn't change at all. It really ends up just being a simple, natural way to scale consensus protocols. So, sharding is like relatively here in theory. Another thing I want to say is that you guys should attend the CBC Casper workshop at 4:45 today. Aditya, who is maybe in the back there, is going to be hosting this seminar. He's going to talk about CBC Casper. Definitely be there. And I was going to do Q&A at the end, but I'll totally take some clapping right now, if you guys don't mind. Thank you.
So my question is, what is the minimum amount of information in addition to the protocol definition that a client needs to trust in order to join the consensus?
Well, in this protocol definition, the validator set is like totally in there. And so, it's totally fine. You can just join right in. Validator set is there forever, it's like permanent. But like a more practical solution, you would have changing validator sets, and it would be like just the same as the proof of stake world, where you need to know, enough validators to authenticate the changes to the validator set going forward. I wonder if we can get some scalability gains on that. It's interesting, but like in my mind, it's basically the same as like proof of stake. Wait for the mic.
Is it only the shards validator set, or also some validators from other shards, or the root or something?
I don't know exactly what you're asking about. Like, so it depends on what validators you're trying to learn about, right? So if you're trying to decide about this shard, like you don't need to know about all the validators over there, but you do need to know about like, the validators that were maybe on the parent shard and its parent and its parent. So like, you don't need to know about everyone, but like, you do need to know someone who's currently bonded in order to start to authenticate anything in a safe way. I'm not sure if you need to know, I don't think you'll need to know everyone. But it's an interesting question. I'll admit that like I usually just assume that it's the same as proof of stake, and I haven't given much thought into making the weak subjectivity thing a little more scalable. But in the worst case, you just need to know all the validators on the branch that you're concerned about.
Okay, thank you.
Cheers. Yeah. Maybe stop here first so you don't have to run back and forth all the time. Yeah. hopefully we have time.
Sorry for so many questions. Yeah, I found this very helpful to ask you directly, other than I have to check on the website, check on the Wikipedia.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
It's not very clear there. So my question is not technical, this one. Is this the version that Ethereum would use in the Ethereum 2.0, or is this your version of
Well, I mean, I hope so, but it's definitely not the official roadmap.
Okay, I see. Okay, that's all. Thanks.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Yes. What are the properties that your protocol is trying to optimize for?
Scalability.
And?
I mean, so I have like, it's like all kind of in line with the non-scalable research also. So I want to have like extra protocol fault tolerance thresholds. I want to have like no rounds. I want to have the possibility of having theoretically optimal network overhead. There's all sorts of like design criteria, you know, having final decisions instead of like not, being able to, you know, have a latency be low and explore this trade-off between like latency and overhead. I have a whole list of design requirements that for normal consensus, and they are all carry over here. And the only additional one here is scaling, really.
All right. So, are these written down somewhere, or?
Probably, but it's probably not too easy to find.
Okay.
I'm sorry. We'll get better.
Yeah.
I do have a question about, do you have any idea of what the size of the message that would be crossed shards? What proportion of message, like if you do, I don't know, empirical studies or things like that?
No, I have no idea. But I can tell you that they're not going to be too big. There's not going to be too many of them. Yeah, sorry. I mean, you know, I'm a theorist.
So, what are your thoughts on complexity, obviously, and this is kind of growing into a bit of a beast. It's a beautiful beast, but obviously there's this sort of trade-off between simplicity and complexity. What are your thoughts on that, and how do we keep it under control?
Well, I mean, the way that I kind of do it is I think about like what are the design requirements, and then I like try to come up with the simplest thing that could fit them all. And I don't try to give up on my design requirements unless I like can prove that it's impossible to meet them. And so I kind of start from the requirements, and then and like, you know, and like I swear it's only as complex as it needs to be, you know. At least like, but definitely, you know, this is something that like people argue about, like what are really the requirements, right? Like no one agrees with me on my list of design requirements. But you know, I insist. You know, I mean, maybe not on, but basically, you know, I'm not trying to do anything too complicated, really. I think it's actually all rather simple, really. Yeah.
Hello. Hi. Here.
I don't see you. Oh,
I'm here,
there you are. Okay.
When do you think sharding will be released on the mainnet?
I don't know. You should ask Vitalik. Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. It's always a good question. We always get it.
Okay. Thanks.
My other favorite answer is soon. Another one is as soon as possible. 2 weeks, 2 wooks. 2 wooks, yeah, that's a classic. All right, well, if we're done with questions, I'm done with my slides. So, thanks so much, everyone. Really appreciate it.